There are moments in life that arrive without warning. Moments so quiet, so personal that they never make the front pages of newspapers. Moments that don't happen under chandeliers or at royal banquets. They happen in a corridor, in a whispered phone call, in a sentence spoken carefully by someone who was there, who witnessed it all, and who has carried it ever since. This is one of those moments. What Princess Anne told Prince William about his grandmother's final wish was not a scandal. It was not a secret that would shake the throne. It was something far more powerful than that. It was the last private thought of a woman who had spent 70 years putting the world first, and who, in the end, only wanted one thing for the people she loved most. When William heard it, he broke. And that moment changed him. By the summer of 2022, Queen Elizabeth II had already lived longer than anyone could have dared to dream for her. She was 96 years old. She had outlasted prime ministers, world leaders, wars, and scandals. She had sat on the throne through 15 prime ministers and had watched the world change in ways that even she could not have imagined as a young girl sitting beside her father in Buckingham Palace. But that summer, those closest to her could see that something had quietly shifted. She was still sharp. She still smiled. She still received visitors with that familiar warmth that never seemed to age. But her body was tired in a way that was impossible to ignore. The walking stick that had once been a small concession was now a constant companion. She had missed trooping the color in June. She had sat out the Thanksgiving service during the Platinum Jubilee celebrations, watching from a distance while the crowds gathered outside. And yet, even as her strength dimmed, her mind remained focused, not on ceremony, not on legacy, not on what history books would say about her reign. It was focused on something smaller and infinitely more important. She wanted her great-grandchildren to remember her. That was it, that was the wish. Not a grand proclamation, not a political directive, not even a message to be read aloud at some future ceremony. According to royal biographer Robert Hardman, the Queen had one clear priority as that final summer began. She wanted every one of her great-grandchildren to come to Balmoral, the sprawling Scottish estate that had always been her truest sanctuary, and she wanted them to leave with happy memories of her. She knew her time had its limits and wanted all her great-grandchildren to have a happy memory of her. She wanted them to know who she was, not as a queen, not as a figure in a history book, but as a grandmother, as the woman who loved them. AOL. That was what she asked for. That was her final wish. Princess Anne knew this because she was there. Of all the people in the world who were closest to Queen Elizabeth II in her final months, it was Anne, her only daughter, the Princess Royal, who stood closest of all. Not just in proximity, but in spirit. Anne and her mother had always shared something that was difficult to put into words, a kind of quiet mutual respect, a shared understanding of what it meant to show up day after day without complaint, without hesitation, without needing applause. Anne had spent decades doing exactly that. She carried out more royal engagements than almost anyone else in the family. She did not seek attention. She did not chase cameras. She simply worked because that was what was expected and because she believed in it. And she was at Balmoral that September. When the end came, quietly, peacefully, Anne was there. She had been with her mother through those final 24 hours, never leaving her side. A private secretary's memo would later describe those final moments as peaceful, no pain, no distress. The Queen simply slipped away. AOL. When Anne released her statement in the days that followed, she said, "I was fortunate to share the last 24 hours of my dearest mother's life. It has been an honor and a privilege to accompany her on her final journeys." She signed it the way a daughter would, not as a princess. As a child who had just lost her mother, she signed it, "To my mother, the Queen, thank you." In those words, anyone paying close attention could feel the weight of what Anne was carrying. She had been there. She had witnessed something that no one else in the family had witnessed in quite the same way. And in the weeks and months that followed, as the royal family navigated grief and a new reign, she carried that experience with her, the knowledge of what her mother had wanted, the knowledge of what had mattered most. Prince William's grief in those early days was visible to the entire world, even as he tried to contain it. He had loved his grandmother deeply. The relationship between Queen Elizabeth and her eldest grandson had always been one of particular tenderness. She had watched him grow from a boy who lost his mother far too soon into a man who was slowly, steadily learning what it meant to carry the weight of the crown. She had believed in him. She had also worried about him. Royal biographers have noted that in her final years, she had concerns about whether William fully grasped the relentlessness of royal duty. whether he understood that being a sovereign was not a role one could approach with fixed hours. A royal aide noted that she feared he sometimes treated royal duty like a job rather than a calling, and that being sovereign was about constancy, not convenience. She hoped he would rise to it. She believed, ultimately, that he would. AOL. But grief is complicated, and for William, losing the Queen meant losing a woman who had been a constant in his life since birth. She had been there after his mother, Diana, died. She had been there when he married Catherine. She had been there when his children were born, George, Charlotte, and Louis, and she had adored those children. They were, in many ways, the continuation of everything she had spent a lifetime building. Before her death, Queen Elizabeth was great-grandmother to 12 great-grandchildren, including William and Catherine's 3 children. AOL. When Anne eventually shared with William the details of what their grandmother had most wanted in her final summer, that quiet, deeply personal wish to have all of her great-grandchildren gathered at Balmoral, to leave them with something happy to hold on to, something in William gave way. It was not the news of a crisis. It was not something dramatic or urgent. It was, in many ways, a simple thing. A grandmother wanting her grandchildren's children to remember her fondly. And yet, for William, it landed with enormous force, because he understood what it meant. He understood the love that had driven it. He understood that this woman, who had guided nations, who had steadied the monarchy through crisis after crisis, who had carried herself with unimaginable dignity for over 7 decades, had turned her heart, at the very end, toward the smallest faces in the room. She had not been thinking about her legacy in the grand, historical sense. She had been thinking about George running across the lawn at Balmoral, about Charlotte laughing at the dinner table, about Louis, still so small, still so new to the world. She had wanted them to remember the summer light in Scotland. She had wanted them to remember her voice, her hands, the way she looked at them. That image of a grandmother, tired but present, planning one last summer of joy for the children who would carry her memory forward, was what broke William. People who were close to him in the period following his grandmother's death have spoken about how much he reflected on what it meant to be next in line. He had always known, intellectually, what the future held for him. He would be king. He had known it since he was old enough to understand what that word meant. But grief has a way of making abstract things suddenly, achingly concrete. He was no longer just the Prince of Wales waiting in the wings. He was the man who would one day sit where his grandmother had sat for 70 years. And the woman who had sat there before him, the woman who had defined what that role could look like at its best, had spent her last summer not polishing a legacy, but making sure the youngest children in her family would carry a smile when they thought of her. That humbled him. It moved him in a way that diplomatic meetings and formal preparations could not. Princess Anne, for her part, had not shared this to upset him. She had shared it because she believed he needed to understand it. Anne had always been direct in that way. She did not soften things unnecessarily, and she did not hide from difficult truths. But she also understood the power of the right word at the right time. And the truth of their grandmother's final wish, simple, pure, uncomplicated by politics or protocol, was something William needed to carry forward with him. Because it was, in its own quiet way, a message to him too. Queen Elizabeth was noted by royal experts to have been blessed in her final months. She was able to put things, as she saw them, in order. She had known her time had limits, and had turned her attention to leaving the people she loved most with something that could not be taken away, a happy memory. AOL. Queen Elizabeth had spent her entire reign modeling something specific. She had shown, year after year, that duty and love were not opposites, that the two could exist together. That you could stand on the world stage, carry the weight of a crown, negotiate with governments, represent a nation, and still, at the end of the day, turn your face toward the people you loved and make sure they knew it. She had never been a demonstrably emotional woman in public. She had been trained not to be. But in private, in the quiet of Balmoral, in the laughter around a family dinner table, in the careful planning of one last summer with her great-grandchildren, she had been something else entirely. She had been a woman who understood that the most important thing she could leave behind was not a monument. It was a memory. William heard that, he understood it. And it settled into him in a way that those who have observed him in the years since believe genuinely shifted how he thinks about his own role. He has spoken, in various public appearances since his grandmother's death, about the importance of family, about being present, about making sure his children grow up with a father who is there, not just in the photographs, but in the room. He and Catherine marked the first anniversary of the Queen's death by visiting Wales, placing a bouquet of white flowers beside her portrait and observing a moment of silence. Both appeared visibly emotional during the ceremony. He has spoken about wanting to carry the monarchy forward in ways his grandmother hoped for, while preserving the values she embodied. And those who know him well say that some of that clarity, that renewed sense of what truly matters, came from learning what she had wished for at the end. It came from Anne. It came from that quiet moment when a sister sat with a nephew and passed on what she had witnessed, not as a formality, not as a briefing, as a gift. There is something deeply human about what happened in that moment between them. Strip away the palaces and the titles and the weight of centuries of history, and what remains is something that anyone, anywhere, could recognize. A grandmother who loved her family. A daughter who sat with her mother in her final hours and carried that love forward. A grandson who heard what his grandmother had wanted and let himself grieve properly, not just for the Queen, but for the woman behind the crown. Those who observe the royal family note that William and Princess Anne share a notably warm relationship. She is genuinely supportive of him and his vision for the monarchy, and has been a consistent presence in his life as he prepares for the responsibilities ahead. That warmth was evident in how Anne chose to pass on this particular piece of their grandmother's story. She did not let it fade. She did not keep it only for herself. She gave it to the person who needed it most. Stallcaster. William was overcome, not because the news was devastating, but because it was tender. And in a family that has so often been required to hold its feelings behind a composed exterior, tenderness can be the most overwhelming thing of all. The monarchy that William will one day lead is not the same institution his grandmother inherited in 1952. The world has changed beyond recognition. The pressures are different. The scrutiny is more relentless. The questions being asked of the crown are harder and more urgent. But the thing that Queen Elizabeth II seemed to understand in her final summer at Balmoral is the same thing that has always been at the heart of any family, royal or otherwise. Show up, be present, make sure the people you love know that you love them. That was her final wish, simple, unshakable, human. And when William learned of it, when Anne told him what their grandmother had asked for, what she had spent her last good days arranging, he wept. Not as a future king, not as an heir to the throne. As a grandson, as a man who understood, maybe for the first time in the full weight of the word, what he had lost, and what, through her example, she had left him.